Hi everybody, it's Darren here. So as I explained in the last episode, I've taken a little bit of a hiatus from the podcast, but I'm going to be starting up some new things now. I've got a few people lined up to be interviewed on the program, and today I'm going to be starting a new segment I'm going to call a weekly roundup. So once a week, I'm just going to go over some thoughts that I have on current events or other things that are going on in the world. And if the last year is any guide, I don't think there's going to be a lack of material to talk about. So let's get started. So the theme for today's weekly roundup is let's get real. So I think a lot of Californians are just in a state of denial. So what do I mean by a state of denial? I mean they're in denial about where the country is, where it's heading, what we can do about it. And this has two chapters, really, because there's two parts of this denial. One has to do with the right wing, for lack of a better word, the Republican side of the aisle, and the other part of the denial has to do with the so-called progressive party. So we'll get to both of those. But in either case, I think there's a good analogy to make here, and I don't like to make this analogy, but I think it's an appropriate one. This is almost like an abusive relationship. Now, what are the aspects of an abusive relationship when someone is in this kind of relationship? What are some things that people think? Well, they didn't really mean it, right? They didn't really mean that. Well, yeah, they did mean it. We can change them. They'll change. They'll come around. No, they're not going to change. Gaslighting. Don't believe what's in front of your face. Don't believe what you see. Don't believe what you hear. And it's our fault. So it's our fault that we haven't been able to change them. These are all aspects of abusive relationships. And I think you can see that with California's relationship with the rest of the country. Californians still seem to be thinking that America really doesn't mean it. It was an aberration what's happened the past few years, and eventually they'll come around. We'll be able to change them. We'll be able to get through to them. It's not happening. They do mean it. They're not going to change. And if they are going to change, and this is the point, if they are going to change, it's not going to be because of us. What control do we have over, some QAnon person in Nebraska or Wisconsin? What control do we have over, some right-wing fanatic in the middle of the country? We can't de-radicalize these people because they're not our neighbors. They're not our family members. We do have some isolated pockets of this in California, but for the most part, this is not a California problem. The people who have to reach these people in the rest of the country are the people who know them. And that's not us. So no, there's little that we can do to change them. And the gaslighting. This is one of the aspects of fascism, that it's this takeover of reality by power. Don't believe what you see. Don't believe what you hear. And I think we can really see that recently. So I want you to keep that in mind, because that's the kind of context that I want you to think about what I'm going to say over the next few minutes. So I'm going to start with a study that came out. This was a couple weeks ago. I guess it was May 27th. And this was on QAnon. So understanding QAnon's connection to American politics, religion, and media consumption. This was put out by PRRI, which is the Public Religion Research Institute. And they surveyed quite a few people and asked them about various tenets, I guess you could say, of the QAnon conspiracies to gauge people's belief, and also then compare that with their partisanship, media consumption, and religious affiliation. So one striking thing is the numbers involved. And what I want you to keep in mind when I go over these numbers is these numbers are for all of the United States. Now, California has 40 million people out of, I think the most recent census was 330 million, which is a little less than 1 in 8, but I think it's probably much closer to 1 in 8. For one thing, it would be closer to 1 in 8 if Trump hadn't been president the past few years and really tightened down on immigration. And also, I think California was undercounted in the census. I think there's some evidence that we were undercounted relative to other states. So let's just say 1 in 8. Okay, 1/8 of the country is California. So when you take that into account, think that obviously California's percentages on these are going to be much lower. I mean, they're not going to be 0, but they're going to be much lower than the American average, which means the average outside of California, and if you throw out a couple other places, like maybe New York and the better part of New England area, these numbers are significantly higher in the middle of the country, the South. So you can add 2, 3, 4, 5% onto these in many parts of the country, and maybe more in certain specific parts. So the major headline number, I think, was a question they asked. They asked 3 statements and asked if you mostly or completely agree with these. The first one, the government, media, and financial worlds in the U.S. are controlled by a group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. So this is like, out of all the QAnon conspiracies in the whole, gamut of conspiracies that it encompasses, this is like the major conspiracy that kind of holds all the other little conspiracies together. And what percent of all Americans mostly or completely agree with this ridiculous statement? 15%. 15%. So that is almost 1 in 6. A similar percentage, also 15%, agree with this statement. Because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. So this is something that I went over, if you go back a couple months ago, I was talking about Mitch McConnell and how he had essentially normalized the idea of political violence in the country. And so, this is a predictable result. 15% say, yeah, we might have to use violence to save the country. So there's another statement that got even higher support. Quote, there is a storm coming. So this storm terminology is a kind of very characteristic terminology for this QAnon stuff. There is a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders. Okay, that was 20%, 1 in 5. This is a very fascist statement. I mean, the idea that there's some kind of a movement or storm coming that will take away the elites and restore the rightful people. I mean, all of these statements are very fascistic. And the idea that there's 15 to 20% of all Americans who say, yeah, I think that's accurate statement is pretty troubling. And again, remember, this is in all of the United States. So take out California, take out New York, take out, a couple other, just not much of the country, just take out just a couple places in the country and add 3, 4, 5% to that. Now you're looking at 20 to 25% in a lot of areas of the country, which is really scary. Now, among Republicans, of course, these numbers go up a lot. So among Republicans, they go up to 23% for the Satan-worshipping pedophiles claim, and 28% for the other 2 statements. So 28%, there's a storm coming, 28%, we might have to resort to violence. That is out of all Republicans. And again, this is a predictable result. As I mentioned earlier, When you have people like Mitch McConnell going up there and saying, yes, what happened on January 6th was a violent insurrection, and we can't condone it, and it's wrong, and the president is responsible for it. Yeah, a few weeks later, yeah, if the president were to run again, would I support him? Of course, yeah. So of course I'll support somebody who is in favor of violence and incited violence. So this is the predictable result. When you have leaders in power who condone political violence, either directly or, through their silence and not standing up to it, this is the result. People get the message, and a lot of Republicans have gotten the message. Oh, and another statistic before we go on to something else here. 29% of all Americans. Now, this is not 29% of all Republicans. This is not 29% of all QAnon people. This is not 29%, of some subset. This is 29% of all Americans believe the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. Okay, so that is very corrosive. You can't be living in a democracy where almost a third of the people don't believe that the election was legitimate. All right, so that's one study. I'll link to this in the notes. Another thing I wanted to get to also was, so a little over a week ago, New America, which is, one of these think tanks of policy people and intellectuals. So they published a statement which has now been signed by close to 200 individuals, the vast majority of which are political scientists, but also people in related fields. So they signed this statement of concern: the threats to American democracy and the need for national voting and election administration standards. And I'm going to read through the entire thing. It's only 9 or 10 paragraphs. I'm going to stop and make some comments along the way, though. But it's not so long, so it doesn't take too long to get through. But I think that there's some important parts here. And I also want to, as I said, kind of stop and make some of my own comments, too. So here it goes. We, the undersigned, are scholars of democracy who have watched the recent deterioration of U.S. elections and liberal democracy with growing alarm. Specifically, we have watched with deep concern as Republican-led state legislatures across the country have in recent months proposed or implemented what we consider radical changes to core electoral procedures in response to unproven and intentionally destructive allegations of a stolen election. Collectively, these initiatives are transforming several states into political systems that no longer meet the minimum conditions for free and fair elections. Hence, our entire democracy is now at risk. So that's the first paragraph. So the only thing I would say here is they say, we have watched the recent deterioration of U.S. elections and liberal democracy. Really? Is it that recent? It's been going on for quite some time. It may be more accelerated now, and it may have taken a slightly different quality, but the idea that the elections and democracy in America have only recently been deteriorating the last few years? No. They've been deteriorating for a long time. Okay, continuing on. Quote, when democracy breaks down, it typically takes many years, often decades, to reverse the downward spiral. Yeah, I would say that's true. The last time that we had the last major breakdown in democracy, I would say in the United States, was Reconstruction, right? So this was, the effort to enfranchise African Americans and really bring democracy to a much wider group of people in the country. And there was a strong backlash to that, as I'm sure you know, with Jim Crow, the Ku Klux Klan, everything that went on over not just years, not just decades. It really took almost 100 years, almost a century, until the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So this is definitely true. It can take years or decades to reverse the downward spiral. Okay, going back, quote, in the process, violence and corruption typically flourish, and talent and wealth flee to more stable countries, undermining national prosperity. It is not just our venerated institutions and norms that are at risk, it is our future national standing, strength, and ability to compete globally. Okay, so they're kind of appealing to a little bit of nationalism here, saying, look, maybe you don't care about democracy, maybe you don't care about elections, but don't you want the country to be competitive in the global economy? Don't you care about business? It's a little bit of an appeal to the elites here, the business community, saying, hey, you may not care about democracy, but if this thing really goes too far south, like it's going to take the whole system with it. And are you sure you really want that? That's what I kind of read between the lines there. The next paragraph, quote, statutory changes in large key electoral battleground states are dangerously politicizing the process of electoral administration, with Republican-controlled legislatures giving themselves the power to override electoral outcomes on unproven allegations should Democrats win more votes. And so I'll just stop here and say, yes, this is the new danger right now. So a lot of people are thinking that the last election was just like, again, an aberration. Like they tried to do something and we stopped them from doing it, so that's great. Well, no. They got away with a lot more than they've ever gotten away with before. If you remember, so I remember the 2000 election. And at the time, there was a lot of hand-wringing over that, right? Because, right, they had the Brooks Brothers riot, they had the Supreme Court. So that was pushing it a little bit. It wasn't maybe as flagrant as 2020, but that was definitely pushing it, and they succeeded a bit, right? They got the president they wanted. But still, the overall institutional norms largely held up. And everybody thought at the time, okay, they got away with this, but we're gonna tamp down on this. We're not gonna let this happen again. Al Gore, basically said, for the sake of the country, we got to move on from here. But we didn't address it. We didn't do anything about it. And this is the point. When you don't address these breakdowns in democracy, if you don't discuss them and do something about them, they come back again and again and again. So 2000 wasn't the last time, right? Then we had 2020, where they pushed it even further. And so thinking that 2020 is like, oh, that's the worst that they're going to get. No, they're just escalating each time. And this is the next step that they're taking now. They're going beyond just voter suppression and politicizing the election and coming up with conspiracy theories about, voter fraud and stuff like that. Now they're actually trying to harness the democratic institutions themselves to rig the election. Okay, that's fundamentally different. That's not just a difference in who gets to vote and how much trouble they have voting and the rules set on voting or how you count or allegations of fraud. No, this is actually trying to change the institutional structure of the running of elections themselves through the legislatures and through the government, so that you're almost guaranteed that you're going to come out on top. Okay, do you understand the difference? Okay, continuing on, quote, they are seeking to restrict access to the ballot, the most basic principle underlying the right of all adult American citizens to participate in our democracy. Okay, so again, I'll point out, if access to the ballot is the most basic principle underlying American democracy, then we've only been a democracy for not very long, only a few decades, because until the Voting Rights Act, we did not have universal enfranchisement. We did not have universal access to the ballot. So, returning to this, quote, they are also putting in place criminal sentences and fines meant to intimidate and scare away poll workers and nonpartisan administrators. State legislatures have advanced initiatives that curtail voting methods now preferred by Democratic-leaning constituencies, such as early voting and mail voting. Republican lawmakers have openly talked about ensuring the purity and quality of the vote. And this is directly in the statement now. They put purity and quality, those two words, they put them in scare quotes. Not my scare quotes, their scare quotes. Echoing arguments widely used across the Jim Crow South as reasons for restricting the black vote. And this is really a good point. They use these words like purity and quality. These are code words. I've been on some of these right-wing Facebook pages and YouTube channels and social media. I listen to kind of what they say, what they talk about amongst themselves. And they use words like these and other words, but you have to kind of understand what they mean when they use them. They don't mean them the same way that everybody else means them. So, for instance, a common thing you'll hear if you go into some of these real far-right social media places is they'll say, well, the Democrats want to take over the country with communism, or the Democrats want communism to overrun the country. And we have to save the country from becoming communist. Now, these people, let's be clear, they don't know the difference between communism, socialism, social democracy, Marxism, anarchism, or a hole in the ground. They have no clue what any of these words mean. So what do they mean when they say communism? What they really mean is we want to stop Democrats from opening up American democracy to anyone other than rich, white, Christian men. That's what they mean when they say communist, in quotes. Now, in reality, okay, the Democrats do want to open up American democracy, but not exactly the way that they think. That they want to open it up to people who are not white, Christian, or men. They're not so keen on opening up to people who aren't rich, though. So that's one thing. They do have those other three parts right, but they don't have the last part right. Neither of the two of them are really keen on opening up democracy to people who aren't rich. But that's what you have to understand about these words: purity, quality, communism, things. These are code words that are used. Okay, going on to the next paragraph. Quote, state legislators supporting these changes have cited the urgency of electoral integrity. And again, not me, them. They put electoral integrity in scare quotes. And the need to ensure that elections are secure and free of fraud. But by multiple expert judgments, the 2020 election was extremely secure and free of fraud. The reason that Republican voters have concerns is because many Republican officials, led by former President Donald Trump, have manufactured false claims of fraud, claims that have been repeatedly rejected by courts of law, and which Trump's own lawyers have acknowledged were mere speculation when they testified about them before judges. In future elections, these laws politicizing the administration and certification of elections could enable some state legislatures or partisan election officials to do what they failed to do in 2020. Reverse the outcome of a free and fair election. Further, these laws could entrench extended minority rule, violating the basic and long-standing democratic principle that parties that get the most votes should win elections. Well, if that's the criterion you're going to use, that it's a long-standing democratic principle that parties that get the most votes should win elections, then we also have a problem going much further back, because the whole system of American government is based upon minority rule. I mean, that's what the country was founded on. America was not founded as some workers' revolt. It wasn't some poor people's campaign. It was some rich people who wanted to protect their assets and property and their ability to expand against another group of rich people. And so this idea of minority rule, that we have to keep out the masses, that democracy is bad, that the popular will is bad, that's baked into the system. It's not a bug, it's a feature. So again, the only thing I would say here, that they're definitely on the right track. The only qualification I would say is this is not new. This is not some aberration in the American system. This is a feature of the system. Continuing, quote, democracy rests on certain elemental institutional and normative conditions. Elections must be neutrally and fairly administered. They must be free of manipulation. Every citizen who is qualified must have an equal right to vote, unhindered by obstruction. And when they lose elections, political parties and their candidates and supporters must be willing to accept defeat and acknowledge the legitimacy of the outcome. The refusal of prominent Republicans to accept the outcome of the 2020 election and the anti-democratic laws adopted or approaching adoption in Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Montana, and Texas, and under serious consideration in other Republican-controlled states, violate these principles. More profoundly, these actions call into question whether the United States will remain a democracy. And I'll interject again here. Remain a democracy? It's not a democracy now. How long has it been a democracy? I mean, maybe it was a democracy for like 10 years, maybe between like 1965 and 1975, or 1965 to 1980. It was a democracy for about 10 or 15 years. I mean, it's not a democracy now. It's an oligarchy. Politicians are bought and paid for by the business class, by capital. I just don't get this idea that we'll remain a democracy. Finishing this paragraph, as scholars of democracy, we condemn these actions in the strongest possible terms as a betrayal of our precious democratic heritage. Well, it's interesting. If it was such a precious democratic heritage, why didn't the elites say something sooner? Why haven't they been saying something for 40, 50, 60 years? Okay, just a few more paragraphs left. Quote, the most effective remedy for these anti-democratic laws at the state level is federal action to protect equal access of all citizens to the ballot and to guarantee free and fair elections. Just as it ultimately took federal voting rights law to put an end to state-led voter suppression laws throughout the South, so federal law must once again ensure that American citizens' voting rights do not depend on which party or faction happens to be dominant in their state legislature, and that votes are cast and counted equally regardless of the state or jurisdiction in which a citizen happens to live. This is widely recognized as a fundamental principle of electoral integrity in democracies around the world. Well, good luck with that. I mean, Joe Manchin has already come out and said he's not only is he not supporting the legislation that's in the Senate right now to address these things, but he doesn't want to end the filibuster. And if you're not going to end the filibuster, why are we even talking about any of this? I mean, it's a non-starter at that point. Quote, a new voting rights law, such as that proposed in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, is essential, but alone is not enough. True electoral integrity demands a comprehensive set of national standards that ensure the sanctity and independence of election administration, guarantee that all voters can freely exercise their right to vote, prevent partisan gerrymandering from giving dominant parties in the states an unfair advantage in the process of drawing congressional districts, and regulate ethics and money in politics, unquote. Yeah, good luck addressing any of those things. These have been problems long before Donald Trump, before Obama. These are decades-long problems. I don't know why you think if these haven't been addressed in the past, what's going to cause them to be solved now. Wrapping up, the last couple paragraphs. Quote, it is always far better for major democracy reforms to be bipartisan. Sorry, I have just to pause so I don't chuckle. Continuing, to give change the broadest possible legitimacy. However, in the current hyperpolarized political context, such broad bipartisan support is sadly lacking. Elected Republican leaders have had numerous opportunities to repudiate Trump and to stop the steal, again in scare quotes, crusade, which led to the violent attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6. Each time, they have sidestepped the truth and enabled the lie to spread. We urge members of Congress to do whatever is necessary, including suspending the filibuster, in order to pass national voting and election administration standards that both guarantee the vote to all Americans equally and prevent state legislatures from manipulating the rules in order to manufacture the result they want. Our democracy is fundamentally at stake. History will judge what we do at this moment. So that's the end of the statement. So again, those last two paragraphs, I mean, I agree with everything they're saying. I would just say they act like we still have a democracy that's being saved. We don't have a democracy. We haven't for a long time. And this is the point that I want to get across to people, is that you can't have a democracy when one of the major parties is fundamentally anti-democratic. When they don't buy into the institutional and political norms that govern elections and policymaking and everything that goes along with it. And this is what we're part of. We're tethered to this system and these people that are fundamentally anti-democratic, that don't believe in democracy. And that's something people here in California really need to sit with. You need to sit with it and think about it. Okay. So that is one side of the political spectrum in America. What about the other side? So let's talk about the so-called opposition. How effective are they? So just a couple days ago, Biden is trying to get his infrastructure plan through, which is already inadequate. And we see a common pattern here, is that Biden appears not to have learned any lessons from Obama. He is compromising with himself, and he's thinking that he can get some kind of bipartisan support. How do you get bipartisan support from a party who doesn't believe in democracy? I don't know what there is to understand about this. So originally, Biden's infrastructure plan was about $2 trillion over 10 years. And it's just been negotiated and negotiated down from there. So now we're currently at a point where he's negotiating with this Problem Solvers Caucus. That's an Orwellian name if I ever heard one. And they are proposing what would amount to an additional $760 billion. Not even $1 trillion. $760 billion over the next 8 years. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. Just to be clear, though, I have heard estimates from the civil engineers, societies of civil engineers, that America needs to spend, at the low end, I've heard $2.5 trillion. At the higher end, I've heard $4.5, $5 trillion over the next 10 years. So this is $760 billion. So that's off by a factor of like 5 or 6. So this is woefully inadequate. And, you'll love the justifications for this. Of course, they're trying to find the pay-fors, which, as I'm going to talk about a lot in the future, when I talk about modern monetary theory, is really a load of bullshit. So Senator Shelley Moore Capito said, "Throughout our negotiations, we engaged respectfully, fully, and very candidly, delivering several serious counteroffers that each represented the largest infrastructure investment Republicans have put forth. Despite the progress we made in our negotiations, the president continued to respond with offers that included tax increases as his pay-for, instead of several practical options that would have not been harmful to individuals, families, and small businesses." So this is the same game that's been played for 30, 40, 50 years. This idea of pay-for. At the federal level, there is no such thing as pay-fors. Taxes do not pay for spending at the federal level. So this is, it's like listening to people arguing about how many angels fit on the head of a pin. There is no pay-for. You just fund it. And this is the trap that we get sucked into. We either have to try and come up with some justification about pay-fors, or we have to say that this is some investment that's going to have a return on investment in the future where we collect more revenue. It's all a bunch of garbage, okay? It's all nonsense because the fundamental premise is wrong. Taxes don't fund spending. So this is something I'll go into a lot in the future about this economic nonsense that continually holds up these bills and prevents us from doing the things that we need to do. So that is infrastructure. Well, you could say, well, okay, Biden's not doing too good on infrastructure. How's he doing on other stuff? Well, we still don't have Joe Manchin on board. So NPR reported just a few days ago, Senator Joe Manchin maintained his opposition to a sweeping set of election overhaul measures known as the For the People Act. You know, why? I don't know why he just doesn't change parties. Why is he a Democrat? Why doesn't he just become a Republican? Manchin wrote in an editorial in the Charleston Gazette-Mail, congressional action on federal voting rights legislation must be the result of both Democrats and Republicans coming together to find a pathway forward, or we risk further dividing and destroying the republic we swore to protect and defend as elected officials. Let me put this into English. In other words, to defeat fascism, we must come together with fascists to find a pathway forward, or we risk further dividing and destroying the republic. What is he thinking? They're the people who are responsible for this. You're not going to get their support. And we could go through a laundry list of other issues: gun control, criminal justice reform, the environment, unions, workers' rights. All of these things are just going to die in the Senate. And Biden is not up to fighting for them. I'm not even sure if he believes in half of them. So this is what we have. And remember the theme for today. Let's get real. So we need to get real about what's happening, what's not going to happen, and where we need to go from here. Because I think a lot of Californians are just in denial. Okay, that's the weekly roundup. Talk to you next week.